is really we're considering that to be an umbrella term for a whole lot of processes that are about understanding how those impacts accumulate and how to monitor and manage those cumulative impacts moving forward. There are quite a few case studies that have already been undertaken of regional cumulative effect assessment. And as I said, there's a lot in Canada. What's interesting is that sometimes there's studies that are standalone studies that are called something like a regional cumulative effect assessment. That's what it says on the cover. One of those examples up there, the blue one, is from Manitoba Hydro. It's one of the Canadian case studies we looked at. And that one is called a regional cumulative effect assessment. That's what it says on the box. In other cases, though, the RCEA process is part of another process, a bigger process, which might be a land use planning process, might be a strategic assessment. So it might be quite buried in amongst a lot of other things. So our project focuses specifically on the bit that's about understanding cumulative impacts. I think it's worth mentioning that although our project is focused on how regional cumulative effect assessment can be a tool to inform good planning for mine closure, it's kind of a hot topic in a lot of different contexts at the moment, much more broadly. And just some of those examples up there are the Commonwealth Government's Nature Positive Plan. So some of you will know that one of the commitments that is in that Nature Positive Plan, which is to do with the reform of environmental legislation at the Commonwealth level, is a commitment to regional planning. And regional planning is seen as the key mechanism through which cumulative impacts on the environment will be managed going forward at the Commonwealth level. So there's a lot of work going on at the moment on what that regional planning framework would look like and how the consideration of cumulative impacts or cumulative effects will be part of that regional planning process. And just a couple of other Western Australian examples. The Western Australian EPA has recently released its latest strategic plan, and there's a commitment there to firstly develop cumulative impact assessment guidelines for proponents, but also to develop things called environmental management frameworks, which are kind of, again, this regional scale approach. And a key aspect of developing those frameworks is the understanding of cumulative impacts. So it's not just cumulative impact assessment that's receiving a lot of focus at the moment, but particularly this kind of regional scale, this understanding that it's really difficult to manage cumulative impacts at a small scale, and really we need to be looking at large scales, which can be bioregions, which can be catchments, those types of things. And similarly, the Western Australian native vegetation strategy also talks about the importance of cumulative impact assessment as a tool for delivering on the objectives of the native veg strategy. So there's been a lot of interest in this research from people outside the mining sector, I guess, and I know some of the people online fall into that category. So there's a lot of learnings that we hope will come out of this that are more broadly applicable. So this project that we're currently involved in builds on a foundation project that was undertaken for CRC time in 2021, which was they did a series of foundation projects, which were short one-year projects, which really, as they say, established the basis for the bigger projects that are underway now. So this project 1.1 was called Towards a Framework for Regional Cumulative Impact Assessment, changed the language then, and essentially it was a literature review. There were some interviews conducted, some case studies investigated, and really the purpose of that was to identify research gaps and therefore to set the stage for the subsequent stages of the cumulative impact or cumulative effects assessment work. One of the key findings out of that work was that the term regional cumulative impact assessment or cumulative effect assessment can mean a lot of different things. And that was partly making it quite confusing to do the literature review, because you kind of needed to untangle what people were actually talking about when they used this term. And we identified 4 different kinds of things that are called, or processes that can be called, regional cumulative effect assessment. The first one is probably the one where there's the most guidance and people are most familiar with who work in the impact assessment field, and that is where proponents of projects, as part of their environmental impact assessment process that they have to go to under whatever regulatory framework, that increasingly those proponents are asked to do a cumulative impact assessment as part of their EIA process. So regulators, including the WA EPA, don't just want to know the impacts of that mine or that project on the environment. They want to know how the impacts of that project will interact with impacts that are already existing, and also the potential future impacts of other foreseeable, and that's where the reasonably foreseeable terminology in the definition comes in. Like what could happen in the future, because it might be that a project might be completely fine by itself, but when you start looking at it in the context of everything else going on, it might be not fine for the environment. So increasingly, cumulative impact assessment is really important as part of project proposals. However, in looking at the context of mine closure, that's not actually a very helpful tool, because firstly, it happens too early in the life of mine process, and also that the kind of cumulative impact assessment or effect assessment that's undertaken by project proponents is by its nature very focused on getting an approval, and it also tends to be quite narrowly defined, both geographically and temporally. And so really it's the other three forms of regional cumulative effect assessment that are more useful and more relevant to the context of mine closure. And those ones are, number 2, is where you do a study of a region to understand what's going on now. So what environmental or social values are under threat at the moment, perhaps, and why is that? What are the different pathways? What's going on in that region that might be causing concern from a cumulative impact perspective? The third one is where you are actually then trying to predict what might happen in the future in order to be able to inform, for example, regional planning. So you might have different scenarios, and you might be needing to predict the cumulative effects under different scenarios in order to choose a way forward, as in a typical sort of planning process. And the fourth one is a process of ongoing monitoring and management of cumulative effects. So sometimes you don't do the analysis particularly, you know that there are cumulative effects, and so you identify what you need to monitor and what you need to manage in order to protect the environment or the social values that you're concerned with. Also, as part of that foundation project, we identified some of the barriers to implementation. So in a mine closure context. So there are examples of regional cumulative effects assessment happening. The mining companies and the CRC partners all agree that RCEA sounds like a really sensible thing to do, and to the extent that it was one of the objectives of the CRC itself, but no one kind of really knows what to do, or quite how to apply that thinking to the mine closure context. And so we identified in that foundation project some of the barriers that were stopping people from just getting on and doing this. They included challenges in how do you define a region in the first place. The fact that once you get past that regulatory EIA stage, there's really very few triggers that would force anybody to get together and undertake a regional scale study. There's really very, very few legal mechanisms that call for such a thing. When you think about a region, there's obviously a lot of different stakeholders. There'll be mining stakeholders, but there'll be many, many other different types of stakeholders in that region, all of whom have got competing interests. So there needs to be a hook to get stakeholders to come and sit around a table and talk about cumulative effects. Associated with that are the challenges in developing collaborative governance models to actually undertake these processes, uncertainty about what tools to use when, a lack of guidance, particularly on how to integrate environmental, social, economic and cultural values. And that's one of the key components of their CRC time objectives, is to really be looking holistically, not just at the biophysical environment. A lack of experience in involving Indigenous people and incorporating traditional knowledge, and a limited availability of data. This one comes up all the time in Australia. Interestingly, not so much in Canada, where they seem to have really well-managed government databases, but the question about where does the data come from comes out all the time. So really those barriers that we identified in the foundation project form the basis of our aims and objectives for the project that we're currently undertaking. So I'll move on now to talk about that project, which is entitled Regional Cumulative Effect Assessment to Support Transitions in Mining Economy. The word transitions there is interesting too, because although CRC time is primarily focused on mine closure, when we were doing the stakeholder engagement for this project and to get partners on board, a lot of the mining companies said, well, we're actually interested in RCEA, not just for mine closure, but for various other transitions that we might go through over the life of the mine, which could be an expansion equally, or it could be a transition to new minerals, particularly critical minerals at the moment. So this project, the current project, is project 4.7 in the CRC time, and we've divided it into 3 stages. We're halfway through stage 1 at the moment. So the overall objective of the 3-stage project is to come up with a package, like a how-to manual, essentially, which will guide mining companies and stakeholders through regional cumulative effects assessment processes. In stage 1, we decided to start with case studies, and that was partly because of this, to help overcome some of those barriers of people just not really knowing, thinking, yep, that intuitively sounds like a good idea, but I'm just not really sure what that looks like. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know how much it's going to cost. I don't know who should be involved, all of those sorts of things. Actually, one of my interviews in Canada, we were talking about this kind of, well, what is this thing and how long does it take? And he said it's said 5 years, $5 million and 500 pages. That's essentially, so that's a typical kind of you know, you will end up with a lot of documentation from these sorts of things. Stage 2, which we're hoping to start early next year, is really doing a bit more of a deep dive into some of the tools and methodologies. And stage 3, we hope will be a pilot study where we actually trial some of these things. So specifically what the objectives and aims of stage 1. Sorry. I'm sure Kate's trying to deal with that. So we'll just... Is it me or is it me? How do I turn notifications off? It's on the laptop, so just need to... I'm a bit reluctant to exit because we have had all sorts of tech problems. Oh, I think we're tempting fate. Sorry, everyone. There's any more people jumping in now anyway, should there? Yeah, let's just keep going. We've got this far. Oh no. Don't chat to it. Now where's my presentation gone? Yeah. Okay. Go back to your presentation. There we go. Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Hopefully that's quietened that down. The main output from this stage 1 will be a decision tree, which will essentially be a guide for people, mining companies in particular, who might be wanting to lead a regional cumulative effect assessment, to step through the questions essentially about how do you set this up, how do you scope it, who should be involved, what are you trying to achieve from that. And essentially, and also there'll be a report of the case study analysis, which will start to draw out some lessons learned about how to actually undertake regional cumulative effect assessment. But most of that how-to will happen in stage 2, and whereas, as I mentioned, the objective there is to develop a toolkit before we move into stage 3. So just a bit graphically what that looks like. We're seeing stage 1 as really answering the questions about what is this, why would you do it, and who should do it. Well, starting to touch on some of the how as they emerge from the case studies, but stage 2 is focused on the how. And so collectively, once we have a clear value proposition for what it is and why you'd want to do it and how you might do it, then we're hoping we'll be in a position to undertake a pilot study in year 3. So the first stage of this process was to do some desktop analysis of case studies. And the Australian case studies we identified are there, and that's just a subset actually of the Canadian case studies because there were so many. Fortunately, a Canadian colleague had recently in 2020 done a kind of a scan of all of the different kinds of examples of these regional studies, and so that was a really, really useful starting point to then be able to identify which ones of those had a cumulative effects focus. So what we did was really start asking questions about, well, what are these things and what are their characteristics that distinguish them? And out of that came up with a draft typology. And I spent a little bit of time on this because The forms that I mentioned before, so the forms 2, 3 and 4 being the most relevant types of regional cumulative effects assessment, are part of that. But there's lots of other ways that these studies can be distinguished. They actually vary quite a lot. The second column is looking at VCs. That's the shorthand for valued component, which is a very impact assessment term, but it basically means what is it that you're worried about? Is it a particular plant? Is it jobs, if you're looking at a social point of view? Is it water quality? Those sorts of things are called valued components in this impact assessment methodology. So some of the studies would just focus really on just a handful of VCs, whereas other ones might have a really, really broad scope and be much more inclusive of social, economic and cultural values as well. The studies also vary according to what stresses, so things that are causing the impacts. Sometimes it might be just industry, it might be just mining, but often there's a lot of competing land uses, and therefore it's important to look at the impacts of all of those different competing land uses, as well as things like climate change over on the top of that. So they can vary a lot in complexity for what these pressures or drivers of change actually are. They also vary a lot in terms of process governance, and this is one of the interesting things that I'll come back to when I talk about the case studies, is that very, very few of these processes are regulatory. In Canada, they do have some regulatory mechanisms, and which are quite similar, in fact, to the regional planning that the federal government and Commonwealth government is looking at the moment. But the vast majority of the case studies that we identified were done not under a strict regulatory framework. In a lot of cases, they were perhaps initiated by government, where a minister might have said, I want a study done, I want a cumulative effect study done over there. But outside a regulatory framework, in the sense that there wasn't necessarily a clear path for the recommendations from those studies to be implemented. So what we found in the case study analysis was that we have these regulatory processes. We also have community-led processes, and particularly in Canada, which I'll talk about, a lot of Indigenous-led cumulative effects assessment processes where the Indigenous communities, the First Nations, are doing it for themselves. There are also examples of industry getting together and doing that because it was in their interests to understand and be able to demonstrate that they're managing cumulative effects as well. But perhaps the most important bit is the right-hand side of the diagram, which is really like, why are you doing this? Who's going to do what with the information that you produce from these studies? And really, I think that's where we really need to be focused. And as we identify and work out this decision tree, that's where we'll start. What are you trying to achieve? And once you know what you're trying to achieve, what decisions might be informed by this study, then you can start asking what the process to get there might be and who might need to be involved. So then the detailed data collection. So I was in Canada for a month and I interviewed 30 people in 9 cities. 26 of those interviews were in person and 4 online. 20 of them were people directly involved in some of the selected case studies. So I was trying to get a bit of a handle on particular case studies to get different perspectives from different stakeholders on how effective that particular case study was. And also, I interviewed 10 researchers and general experts in the area. I also attended the Indigenous Centre for Cumulative Effects conference in Ottawa, and I'll come back to talking a bit about that centre later as well. And had started some of the Australian interviews by doing a couple of those in Canberra on the way home. So moving on to some very preliminary insights from Canada, because we're still right in the middle of doing the detailed analysis. There are really 5 key reflections and points that I wanted to make. One is the emergence and growth of Indigenous-led regional cumulative effects assessment, and in fact, Indigenous-led impact assessment generally. Secondly, that there are a number of enabling institutions in Canada that are supporting the practice of cumulative effects assessment. A little bit about the integration of Western and traditional knowledge. A few caveats around the regulatory cumulative effects assessment that's happening in Canada. And a final reflection that there really is no one size fits all. And as I said before, the really key thing is knowing what it is that you're trying to achieve with these processes. So a bit about the Indigenous-led cumulative effect assessment. I could give a whole presentation about this, but it was really fascinating that individual First Nations in Canada are undertaking studies, regional studies of the cumulative effects happening on their land. And not just studies, but they're using that to chart their own futures, to make suggestions and recommendations about forestry, for example, to regulators, and to ensure that what's important to them are not being impacted unnecessarily by cumulative effects. And there's a lot of drivers for why this is happening in Canada, and not all of those drivers are not the same as they are here. But one really key thing, I guess, is an alignment between an Indigenous worldview and the concept of cumulative effects, because the idea of looking at the environment holistically fits really well with an Indigenous worldview. So cumulative effect makes sense to traditional owners, to First Nations people in Canada. And just a quote from one of the interviews, it's just a natural thing to do, because when you have a perspective on the holistic approach of a territory, our relationship to territory, understanding it piece by piece just doesn't make sense. But there are a few other drivers for the emergence of Indigenous-led impact assessment. One is, and it's particularly strong in British Columbia, and that's partly because British Columbia has passed an act. They have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, which is how British Columbia is going to take into consideration the fact that Canada has signed up to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So they're now systematically going through all of their legislation and ensuring that it meets the principles of UNDRIP. Also, in some of the legislation in Canada, including the Federal Impact Assessment Act and the British Columbian Impact Assessment Act, there are mechanisms by which an impact assessment that's led by the Indigenous people, the First Nations that are affected by a particular development, can be legally recognised. It's called a substitution principle. So it's possible for a First Nation to undertake an impact assessment and then have the government say, okay, that is now the official impact assessment, and the findings of that are binding. It's not a mechanism that's been used very much, but it's there in law. And I guess because of that, partly because of that, there are lots of examples of First Nations working together with proponents and with government regulators to undertake a cooperative approach to impact assessment. And one of the key drivers is a legal case, which is called the Blueberry River First Nation Treaty case, which I'm just going to talk about briefly. So one of the main differences between Canada and Australia in relation to Indigenous rights is that Canada has a series of historical treaties. They also have modern treaties, but the historical treaties were signed in the late 19th century. And essentially what this case is about, without going into too much detail, is that the Blueberry River First Nation, which is in British Columbia and is part of the Treaty 8 region, sued the British Columbian government because they said the cumulative impacts of development that the government had allowed on their land had really adversely affected their ability to live traditionally on their land, which was guaranteed to them under that treaty. And they won that case. It took 7 or 8 years to go through court, but they won that case. And so now the British Columbian government is having to sit down with that First Nation, and any development that happens in that First Nation has to go through the elders and the process of that nation. So it's a real shifting in the power balance. So First Nations, particularly in British Columbia, are now expecting to be able to sit down with provincial and federal governments and negotiate government to government. They don't see any difference between them and the Crown, essentially. Quite a few regulatory mechanisms for regional scale cumulative effect assessment. One of them is called regional assessment under the Impact Assessment Act. The Impact Assessment Act only came into force in 2019, and the regional assessment components had a few teething problems. Haven't been any such studies completed under the new Act, although there's one that was finished under the new Act that was started under the previous one. That one is currently in court, and there's a few others that they're trying to get off the ground and it's taken a really long time to get terms of reference. The main issue with this seems to be that when the process is regulatory and therefore has really tight implementation mechanisms and legally binding outcomes, participants and stakeholders are obviously fairly nervous at the beginning about what the implications are going to be. And so it takes a long time to negotiate the terms of reference. And the approach so far and the preliminary guidance that the Canadian government has issued has been criticised for really focusing a lot on streamlining development. So the idea is that you do a regional study and that helps to streamline future project developments at the expense of really delivering on some of the other objectives of the Impact Assessment Act, which are things like sustainable development and environmental protection. So the idea of regional planning and regional scale cumulative effect assessment are really to achieve both of those things. And the Australian government in the Nature Positive Plan is really saying the same thing, that we need to do regional plans in our case in order to protect what needs to be protected, but at the same time give a clear indication to developers about where development is likely to be acceptable and not, and just potentially streamline. So the issue in Canada at the moment is that the mechanism is perceived to be too much towards promoting development and not enough towards the other objectives. And really that there's no one size fits all, which I think is obvious anyway from the typology. But I'm just going to share a couple of quick examples just to show some of the variation in cumulative effect studies that we noticed. One is the Buffalo National Park Strategic Environmental Assessment. So this is a pretty extraordinary part of the world. Unfortunately, it's really hard to get to, so we didn't get to go and visit it. But it's on the Alberta Northwest Territories border, and it encompasses the Peace Athabasca Delta, which is one of the largest deltas in the world, and it's a Ramsar wetland and a World Heritage area and home to several First Nations. And one of those First Nations, the Mikisew Cree people, wrote to UNESCO and said, we're really concerned about the cumulative impacts and we want you to ask for a cumulative effects assessment to be done. And the approach that they took was called a strategic environmental assessment, but really it was a cumulative effect assessment. They took a largely qualitative approach and largely driven by Western literature and Western science, but they put a lot of effort into understanding the pathways through which the cumulative effects were happening. And that's one of the illustrations that just really shows the interconnectedness of the environment and all of the forces acting on the environment. And the primary objective really was to understand that. That's what they were trying to do. So they identified the key values, which were related to the universal values of the World Heritage Area, and looked at the trends in those values, whether they were going up or down, and understood the mechanisms through which those impacts were occurring, and then tried to make predictions of whether the trend was going to go up, down, or stay the same. So it was really all about understanding what was going on and how the park and how the delta were being impacted by development outside the park primarily. By contrast, I interviewed someone from the Adams Lake Indian Band. So this is another BC First Nation, and they've been doing cumulative effects assessments over their territories for quite a few years. And these are just 4 of the reports that they've issued. And they take a really quite a very quantitative and very technical approach using a tool called RCEA, which stands for a landscape cumulative effects simulator. And I know Mike is here, and Mike has some experience working with RCEA because the RCEA guys have actually spent quite a lot of time in Western Australia. So it's a landscape scale GIS-based system which can model different land uses. And what they've done typically is integrate that with a water model called Raven, in order to understand how different land uses impact on stream flows and those sorts of things. And they've used this to chart, to identify areas where forestry might be more appropriate within their region, for example. They've used it to look at, there's an oil pipeline that goes through their territory, and they've used this tool to help predict what could cause a failure of that oil pipeline, essentially, with things like erosion and those sorts of things. So they've got a whole suite of these models now, to the point that they've employed recently an officer in their organisation whose job is managing this model and undertaking cumulative effect assessments. By contrast, another Indigenous-led cumulative effects management program, the Metlakatla people, which is on the north coast of British Columbia, so near Prince Rupert, they've taken a very, very qualitative approach where their primary focus has been getting the whole community and all of their elders involved. So they have a census of questions, and really it's all about understanding the lived experience of cumulative effects from the people, which tells them what they need to focus on, what they need to monitor. And they've had 5 different values that they're looking at the moment. And just a quote from one of those interviews. And the one thing we knew we didn't want to do was to go down a really technical path where we were relying really heavily on scientific data and information, because you don't have long-term data, you can't set thresholds. Our understanding of triggers or limits is that they're value-based, just like they're informed by what we're comfortable with. So a different First Nation taking a completely different approach, because that suited where they were at, where the development pressures they were facing, and where their community was at. So really, I think one of the main takeaways in terms of how to do regional cumulative effect assessment is really start with knowing what you need to know. And there's a quote there about just being really clear about who's going to do what with the information that you generate, because it can be really tempting to start a big scale project and let's do lots of studies, and there needs to be a call about what studies we actually need to do and for what purpose and what are we trying to achieve. And just to wrap up a little bit, to bring it back to mine closure, which is the specific purpose of the research project, one of my interviewees looked at me at the end of the interview and said, "Why mine closure?" He said, "Why mine closure?" Because normally these studies tend to be done in advance of development, or at least when development started but is predicted to increase. And the idea is to facilitate and facilitate development while still protecting the environment. So it's got a kind of a development focus, whereas we're really talking about closing down mines and things. And so I thought that was actually a pretty good question. So I thought about the types of questions that a typical regional cumulative effects assessment might answer. Where are we now? What's going on? Where are we heading? How do we get to where we are? Where should we go? What needs to be protected? What needs to be monitored and managed? They're exactly the kinds of questions that you ask in a kind of a regional planning process, but they're really equally applicable in a mine closure context, because you want to know what are the legacy issues of concern, what are the potential socioeconomic impacts of the closure, and where are the opportunities for that community, what levers are available to manage impacts and realise opportunities, what are the implications of different potential post-mining land uses and post-mining economies that might be possible, and still what needs to be protected and what needs to be monitored and managed. So I think that even though it's kind of considered a slightly unusual application of regional cumulative effect assessment, I think it actually is a really good fit. And the next steps are to finish analysing all of that data, 32 interviews and a lot of extra documentation that we collected. Still some Australian case study interviews to complete, and the preparation of the report, the development of a draft decision tree. So Renee and I will be running a workshop at the CRC Time Annual Forum in the Latrobe Valley in November, which will probably be the first time that we hopefully will have a draft decision tree then, and we can start working through that with our partners. But there'll be other workshops for our project partners, specifically developing that decision tree, which will be a planning tool for stakeholders wanting to undertake a regional cumulative effect assessment. We have quite a lot of partners, so very big thanks to all of them, and particularly CRC Time itself, WABSI and Murdoch. And I think there's a few minutes left for questions. Thank you.
Perhaps we start with questions from within the lecture theatre, and then we can go from there with any questions online.
Has been any like cumulative effects in the cell?
Yeah, no, there have been quite a few, and I just have done less analysis on those because they're kind of easier to get to. So, yeah, but they have one of the really good examples was the Great Barrier Reef, and it has a similar story to the Butler National Park, where UNESCO actually requested that cumulative impact assessment be done, and that was about in 2012, and the outcome of that is a cumulative impact framework for the Great Barrier Reef. So yeah, there's been quite a lot done in relation to fracking and unconventional gas. There've been quite technical cumulative effect studies done on those. There's been one that's very much about ongoing management and monitoring of cumulative effects, which is called the Boomtown indicators in various parts of the eastern states, which is really looking at what are the cumulative effects of development, particularly resource development, and having a community-led approach to monitoring those. So there are, and I will be getting into analysing those properly in the next 6 months.
Any more questions from
We have one online.
Online?
I think we can speak that next week. So Julian Dienzo online says, hi Jenny, great presentation. What's the role of data sharing between companies, including RCEA?
No, it's the $1 million question, and it's not even just regional. It's not even cumulative effect assessment. Just it's impact assessment generally. So within Western Australia, we have a lot of initiatives of collecting that data. So project proponents are required to provide that data to the government when they've done surveys, for example. So the idea is to gradually build up a database. There are also projects actually being run through WABSI on the shared analytical framework for the environment. I don't know whether Renee wants to speak about that at all.
I'm leading that piece of work. Colleague, schedule is shared between WABSI and yes, shared framework, analytical framework for the environment, and it's a conceptual framework around how do you structure what are all the governance and structural ways you need to consider if you're actually going to be doing shared analytics. So that's been released for a number of years now. We've just recently released the second version of that. That's available on the website, and we're now moving into piloting that workshop of that framework. One in Pilbara and one in Cooperative as well, where we're actually getting big companies to make agreements and share data for decision making. So it's a really great first step. It's exciting to see that coming together, and the combination between the data thing and what we're doing here is the theory and practice coming together, which is an exciting piece of work.
Yeah, it's so important. And it was really interesting in Canada because hardly anybody raised data. It's the first thing that everybody says in Australia, and hardly anybody raised it in the interviews in Canada. And it seems that there are well-maintained government databases. So there was one particular example where I said, well, didn't you have industry involved in this? Like, how did you get the data from industry about what they're doing in order to assess the impact? And they said, oh, it's all online. We didn't need to. We didn't need to engage with them because it's all online. And that was quite extraordinary from our perspective to have that kind of access. So yeah.
So Nathan Garner says, hi Jenny, but is this type of cumulative
Yeah, and this again, the whole governance piece is really, really important. I think there has to be a role for government. Actually, I think that it's, I think really, I don't know if that matters. I think government has to be there. There are examples where industries got together and said, okay, we're going to assess and manage the cumulative impacts. There's a port in Queensland where that was done. But I think without that impetus and without that oversight, firstly, it runs the risk of not representing all stakeholders if government's not involved, and also that those kinds of collaborative voluntary frameworks eventually run out of steam. People leave. The immediate requirement to have that group of people working together kind of disappears, and so I think government can provide some continuity, which is really important.
As a representative from the Aboriginal Corporation in Butler, and a lot of mining activity, the cumulative and holistic effects of post-mine closure, with lakes and waters and jetties, etc., is definitely something that we're concerned about. So it's going to see the project.
Oh, that's great. And there is another CRC time project specifically looking at pit lakes, and it's not just a technical studied that. They're taking into consideration the social and cultural implications of those pit lakes that are left behind after mining filled with water. As well. So I know that we're sort of watching what that project is doing as well. That's the thing with CRC time. There's so many links between all of the projects. You kind of want to know how your project fits with all of these other projects, and that's one of them.
So can you speak about the difference or maybe the similarities between holistic impacts and cumulative impacts? I didn't get this really. I
get it. Trish could answer that question. Yes, sorry. Oliver asked the difference between holistic and cumulative impacts, and those two. The term holistic is a Western Australian term, like it's a term that we use, and in very, very simple terms, what it means is the holistic impacts are the total impacts of a project, but recognising that there are knock-on effects of things. So you do something over here, and it doesn't just affect the groundwater; it also affects the veg and those sorts of things. So it's the kind of the sum total of the impacts for one project, whereas cumulative impacts are typically looking at multiple different projects as well. That's very, 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 very simplistically, but we're kind of working on clarifying that.
Join the